Let me read to you a passage from the 14th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, verses 1 to 6. It's the Gospel for Friday of the 30th week in Ordinary Time. St. Luke writes, "One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, 'Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?' But they remained silent. So he took the man, healed him, and sent him away. Then he asked them, 'If one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out?' To this they could find no answer." That's from Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 6. Among other things, it suggests thoughts on the relation between faith and reason. What do I mean? Well, there is an implication in our Lord's words to the Pharisees and experts in the law which can easily escape us. The issue here on which Christ and his opponents locked was the observance of the Sabbath. Now, let us remember that the observance of the Sabbath was a point of divine revelation. It was the third of the 10 Commandments, the third of the 3 that governed the people's direct dealings with God. The day of rest was to be kept holy. It was to be observed as the Lord's day. This meant synagogue and rest from the workaday week. And it was a defining feature of the life of the Jewish nation, as scholars of ancient Mideastern societies will readily affirm. They all had their feasts and observances, but Israel had, in addition to its many feasts, the weekly Sabbath. Further, we must acknowledge the beneficial influence of the Pharisaic class in reinforcing the Sabbath in the life of the nation. Their traditional activity included the interpretation of unclear statements in the biblical scrolls and the enactment of prescriptions that carried authority. They formulated specific laws that they deemed necessary for the needs of the time, such as the practical details of the Sabbath rest. Now, much of their legal system was built up on what the sages determined through reasoning and established practice. And there was a biblical foundation for their authority to innovate. In chapter 17, for instance, of the book of Deuteronomy, the inspired text in verse 9 directs that if there is a case too complicated to resolve, the people were to go to the Levitical priests or to the judge in office, who will study the case and give his decision. And then, according to this decision that they give you, we read, you shall act, being careful to do exactly as they direct. Indeed, elsewhere our Lord affirmed their authority, the authority of the Pharisees, Matthew chapter 23, verse 3. The point I am making here, though, is that their prescriptions involved not only revealed law, but a human application of it to perplexing cases. It involved the right or wrong use of reason. Now let us notice what our Lord says to them in today's exchange in the Gospel I read. Our Lord is in the house of a leading Pharisee. Incidentally, his being invited shows that our Lord himself was not perceived by them as hostile to their class or members as such. The leading Pharisee and his class were watching him narrowly to see if he obeyed the law of the Sabbath. This, of course, meant to them the Pharisaic regulations and traditions on the Sabbath. Those regulations were built up by reason and custom, and it is to reason and common sense that our Lord immediately appeals. Is it against the law to cure on the Sabbath? Our Lord asks. Our Lord places his simple question before a leading Pharisee and others of his group. And there they stood, with mutual support, and with their tradition behind them, but they remained silent, presumably because they, including the leading Pharisee, would not dare to enter into religious debate against Jesus of Nazareth. Christ dominated the scene of ideas and teaching. He repeatedly silenced his opponents, finally reducing them to implacable and secret scheming against his person. Here now he appeals to ordinary reason. So he took the man, we read, healed him and sent him away. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out?" To this they could find no answer. With good reason, you extricate your son or your ox from his situation of difficulty on a Sabbath, then surely you ought to do the same with one enchained in illness. Such is only reasonable. It is but good sense, is it not? Among many things this reminds us of is the importance of the right use of human reason in living a life based on what God has revealed. What God has revealed has to be applied in everyday life. We do that application by reason. Christ himself applied it concretely to life, but of course left many things, many details of life untouched. He entrusted his authority to teach to the 12, and in particular to Simon Peter. The Church applies the teaching of Christ to the extent it deems necessary, but we too must do this in our everyday life. Faith and right reason work in tandem in a properly religious and Christian life. The Catholic Church has an extensive teaching on the relationship between two great gifts of God, faith and reason. Each needs the other for each to function properly in the knowledge and fulfillment of the life of the will of God. One of the elements in the tragedy of many Pharisees and experts in the law was their profoundly deficient use of reason, which itself was rooted in their sinful heart. Let us then preserve in our lives a properly Catholic esteem for the moral reason and its place in a life based on divine revelation.